Well, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you may be across the world. Hopefully you're joining at the right time because weird global time zones. So in America, we are at the right time, the time that we're set, but in the rest of the world, we may be a little an hour earlier for the next few weeks. So if you have joined us, that is awesome that you managed to work that all out. We've got many places where we're streaming today. We're on the AWS Events Twitch channel. We are also on the AWS Events YouTube channel. Sorry, the AWS. I don't even know where we're streaming. What's going on? The AWS Twitch channel, the AWS Events YouTube channel, and also Facebook, and also via LinkedIn Live. So welcome wherever you're joining us from. Today we are diving into one of my favorite services at AWS, and we have Dan and Pooya who can be diving into all things step functions. First of all, Pooya, you haven't been on Serverless Office Hours before, so welcome first of all. Tell us, how did you land up at AWS and then working on awesome step functions?
Hello, everyone. So my name is Pooya. I'm working for a step function for more than 5 years. And actually, I believe it's not my first time. I did one maybe 2-3 years ago, but yeah, it was a long time ago. So yeah, I was part of AWS Step Function and especially the developer experience part of it for more than 5 years. And happy to be here.
Cool. So all the DX stuff we've got you to thank. That is awesome. And Dan, welcome back to Serverless Office Hours. So nice to have you here. I feel like you're one of sort of the OG step functions people. So yeah, for people who haven't met you before, what's your journey to AWS and step functions?
Yeah. So I actually joined our team around the same time as Pooya, about a bit over five years ago. So the journey to step functions back when I joined, the team was quite small. And they were kind of working to, at the time, sort of dramatically improve our developer experience for the service. And so they were kind of like ramping up the team. And so I joined the team. I've worked closely with Pooya for the last five years or so. And when I joined, I was a product manager focused on developer experience for step functions. Now I'm kind of focused on kind of product overall for application integration. So that's like our step functions and event bridge service.
Cool, excellent. Well, we're going to dive more into that. But just before we do, yeah, it's so nice to see where people are coming from. So please send us a hello and let us where you know coming from. Good friend of Serverless Office Hours, Daniel from Sao Paulo in Brazil. Lovely to see you. And yeah, Daryl, nice to see you again as well. Hi, Dan and Pooya, nice to see you today. Greetings from Ottawa. So we've got Ottawa and Sao Paulo at the moment. I know we normally have people all over the world. So yeah, please let us know where you are coming from. And remember, we are live, so send us your questions and your comments. If you are watching in the recording afterwards, well, you still get to hear everything, but haven't got quite the option to do the questions. We know what that is. So somebody's meeting is coming up. But just to set the stage, and we are on some new channels and everything. Step functions, Dan, what is step functions? Why would customers be interested? What would they use it for? Tell us about step functions.
Sure, yeah. So we often call step functions sort of like a visual workflow service. So why visual? What do we mean by workflow? Well, it's basically an orchestration service. So if you want to build things that span all of AWS, or if you just want to build with Lambda, you essentially need a orchestrator. The orchestrator is what allows you to sort of like link together multiple services, do it in a way that's like safe for the cloud. So obviously failures can occur across. So you're essentially building a distributed system. You can have network issues, services can be down, things like that. A workflow engine helps you build applications makes it a lot easier to do so and like deal with all of the faults that can happen when you're building on the cloud in kind of an easy way. And what it allows you to do is basically orchestrate APIs or calls to other services. So whether those are calls to AWS services like Lambda or SNS, or calls to a service that you have built, maybe it's running on premise or somewhere else, or there's SaaS software that you're trying to integrate together. Well, step functions makes that easy. You use visual workflows and to basically stitch together all of these calls to other services into patterns, which are basically our distributed transactions. So you describe in there what's the sequence of API calls that you want to make. how you want to handle faults and errors when they occur, and when there's a problem, perhaps how you want to like unwind the transaction. You can even use it to do things like, I'll give you a few examples. Let's say that you want to partition some of your work across, say, Lambda or ECS. We have a lot of customers that sort of pick and choose which service that they want to send work to. We also have features like that enable large scale parallelism, like distributed map, which kind of gives you like a map reduce pattern for the cloud that any developer, very accessible to any developer. So what Step Functions allows you to do, orchestrate across the breadth of AWS, almost every service, almost every API can be sort of stitched together to build workflows. So IT automation, data processing, building serverless applications, you name it, anything that requires sequencing API calls together, that's what Step Functions is designed for.
Excellent, thanks, Dan. And some people like to say, Step Functions can be sort of a low-code thing, and some people freak out at that and go, low-code, anything that's normally low-code, that's surely not a good kind of service. But the cool thing with Step Functions, as Dan was talking about, is you can connect to any AWS SDK. So think of it as a sort of distributed workflow engine that has the AWS SDK built in. And so any AWS SDK call, and Dan, you probably know more than me, there are like 12, 13, whatever, 1,000 of those are just literally built into Step Functions. And so you want to read and write to DynamoDB, or you want to do something to do with Lambda, or you want to do something to do with anything on AWS. I mean, even grabbing secrets or app config, anything, you can just use Step Functions natively without having to write any code, and that's in configuration. So it means you don't have to patch anything. You don't need to upgrade any Node or Python or Java or Go versions. So yeah, super flexible.
Yeah, that's a good point, because like basically any workflow that's been written and built on the service since day of launch, like those can remain untouched, continue to run, and like you never need to patch them, update them, or anything like that. Like we basically guarantee that since anything that's is built at the beginning of the service will continue to run to this day without any issues.
Okay, cool. And yeah, we've got some questions. So schizophrenic web developer, always love that term. How are Step Functions charged? By duration, I suppose, or execution?
Yeah, so great question. So there's actually two variants of Step Functions, and so I think that's a great lead in. And we could add extra workflow types in the future. But today we have two workflow types. So it's like standard and express workflows. They're both written using the Amazon States language, which is a DSL. And how it's charged depends on what workflow type you're running. So Step Functions, we charge for state transitions. So basically, as you go through the workflow step by step, each state in the workflow is one state transition. And that's how we charge. Express workflows are priced a little bit differently, though. So express workflows are priced maybe more similar to how Lambda is priced. So these are in-memory workflow executions. So standard workflow, every step through the workflow, we call them a state transition, is checkpointed, and we guarantee once and only once execution of every step. Express workflows, these are like in-memory execution. They run a lot faster at much lower cost. And the cost dimensions there are basically invocations and gigabyte seconds. So depending on how much memory the workflow uses and the duration of the workflow, so they run for up to 5 minutes, whereas standard workflows can run for up to a year. You don't pay to wait in that case. And so yeah, so it's state transitions in the case of standard workflows, or invocations in gigabyte seconds in the case of express workflows.
Okay, awesome. And then Peter Chu, thanks for joining us via LinkedIn. Can we orchestrate workflows within the AWS ecosystem only, or integrate with third-party systems as well? And then, of course, we're in the world of GenAI, so how about MCP servers? Can we use them?
Yeah, so another excellent question. So the answer is all of the MCP servers. It's essentially all of the above. Like basically, we have customers. We introduced HTTP endpoints feature 2 years ago. Last year, we introduced private endpoint support. And so basically, you can orchestrate across not only AWS APIs, but across use the HTTP endpoints feature to orchestrate across like your on-premise server or like any public endpoint. And then with the launch of private endpoints feature last year at reInvent, now you can orchestrate like call anything within a VPC as well. And you can also access on-premise systems. So yeah, basically, in general, like there's nothing stopping you from orchestrating now across the span of breadth of AWS SaaS providers and your on-premise systems or VPCs.
I can add
definitely
Sorry. We also have activity. You can create your own activity and run your activity and return the result. So a step function will wait for your activity. Also, you can call any service, internal or external, and pass a task token. And again, a step function can wait for your task token. So you have multiple ways to orchestrate your internal, external services.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And just back onto the MCP thing, often, if people are using any GenAI kind of things, as you mentioned, MCP, there's a lot of waiting that goes around for that. So you can, just call Bedrock, where there's a native integration from Step Functions to Bedrock, send what you need to Bedrock, wait for the response to come back from Bedrock, and then, parse that response and do other kind of things. And also, as Pooya mentioned, the waiting, Step Functions could last for up to a year. So yeah, this is great for, you need human in the loop or some other kind of thing. So yeah, very, very sort of flexible. So Dan, you talked about some of the reInvent announcements. Anything else do you want to dive deeper into any of those, or what would you like to cover?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, why don't I share some of our recent announcements? There's actually one more thing I wanted to say about like recent use cases that we're seeing customers build on Step Functions. And that's basically like turn your workflow into an agent. So agentic workflows, we're starting to see customers build those. And the nice thing about Step Functions, coupled say with like Lambda and DynamoDB, is it allows you to build like at scale, or basically you have your at scale application. Well, now you can kind of integrate agentic capabilities into that at scale application using Step Functions and say Bedrock and some of these other services. So that's a new use case that we're seeing customers that build out. And what it does, Step Functions gives you like increased like determinism, visibility into what can often be a black box, et cetera. So that was one other use case that I thought be worth mentioning. We could also dive into that more later if we would too.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, we definitely going to go into the visual aspect of Step Functions, because I think that's one of the, obviously the key things from it. But just before we do, we've had so many messages from people in cool places. So Adrian Warner, thank you for joining us from Arizona, USA. We have Paris from India. It's getting late in India, so thank you, Paris. Louis joining us from Colorado, somewhere in Colorado. We've got Joseph from Mission Viejo in California. More people from India. Andrew, thank you for joining us from India. We have Azrat from Las Vegas. Cool. David's joining us. We have from Kenya. Really appreciate you joining us from Kenya. So we've got Kenya so far. Bangladesh is so far. Abdul. We've got Nagaraju, not quite sure where, and Guyana. So wow. Spanning the globe so far, and Sao Paulo as well has just joined us. Thank you, Douglas, for joining us. So how's that for a good global Serverless Office Hours? So keep telling us any questions and comments. We'd love to hear from you. But Dan, and Pooya, what we're really talking about today is some new functionality of having Step Functions in your local IDE. But to just sort of wind the clock back, we talked about the visual experience. What is Step Functions' visual experience on AWS within the console? And then we can cover how that all works locally nowadays.
Yeah, so before Pooya jumps into the demo, we have this tool called Workflow Studio. We launched that a couple of years ago, and what it is it's a visual builder that works in the console, and it allows you to build workflows. Basically, on the left-hand side, you have every AWS API and all the kind of the workflow capabilities. On the right-hand side, you configure and build out your states. You'll see it in a minute. And what it essentially is a visual builder that generates all of the code as you build visually and say update the definitions of your states. What it does in the background is it generates your workflow code in the Amazon States language. It does it in real time, and the visualization is sort of a perfect representation of the code that you're writing. So you can interchangeably go back and forth between the two. And that seamless transition is what has made Workflow Studio, I think, be so like valuable to customers. So yeah, basically it's a visual experience that allows you, constructs the code in the background as you build visually.
Okay, so I suppose, I mean, beforehand, I know that, because Step Functions runs ASL, which is Amazon States language, and it is a DSL, very powerful, but that's a lot of text. And if you have to write out all that text yourself, that's going to be difficult and challenging. I know GenAI is actually pretty good at writing the ASL at the moment anyway. But yeah, to have a visual builder to be able to drag and drop things. And then when Dan was talking earlier about the SDK integrations, you want to connect to Dynamo, you want to connect to anything, that is literally just drag Dynamo onto the little canvas, fill in some SDK information on the right-hand side, and off you go. Just creates that DSL in the background. So yeah, and I will say sort of self-critically that some people, I think quite rightly over the years, have said that AWS maybe hasn't won the best awards for all of the some of the visual things within the console. But really, honestly, the Step Functions team has knocked it out the park with this Workflow Studio and really sort of set the bar for what a really good developer experience can be on AWS. And they've also pushed some other teams to be able to improve the developer experience. So that's also a good thing that Step Functions is showing the way that we can do visual things on AWS. So Dan, what was the genesis of Workflow Studio? I mean, obviously, talking to customers and finding out that they would have liked that, but that must have been quite a thing to build.
Yeah. So, basically, how we ended up here was, in the world of software development, there's essentially a couple things that are like quite visual, right? So obviously, developers work in the world of code and write code, and code isn't visual unto itself, but basically, architectures are often drawn out visually. And the other thing that's drawn out visually is basically your flow or business process, your path of execution through the code. A lot of times, developers like to either start from a visual diagram of what they're building that maps to like a business process, or they like to sketch that out and then share that with stakeholders to get their feedback and say like, hey, is this process that I'm representing in my code, does this map to your understanding of what the business needs are? And so I've heard time after time that like the visual representation of the workflow, folks find that like really, really valuable. And so we had a lot of customers that came to us and said, have you thought, like originally we just visualized the workflow at the time of execution, or we could visualize the code, but we had a lot of customers that came to us and said, like, have you thought about like allowing us to also like build visually? And so this was kind of timed where like I joined AWS. About 6 months in, I went to reInvent and I hosted 6 builder sessions at reInvent. And this was all getting people to write code or build workflows in the Amazon States language. And I would say that was like watching customers like try to learn the language and build what was inherently like a visual language, but like writing it with code. I definitely like was watching that and I'm like, you know what, we can do better than this. And so it kind of came back from reInvent. And during the course of that year, started basically put a proposal together. So internally at Amazon, we use something called like a PRFAQ. So it's the press release that you would use at the time of launch of a product, and a bunch of like FAQs that answer questions around the product. And so I put me and our like lead UX designer at the time kind of put a proposal together about like building a kind of a visual builder for workflows. And I would say that there was quite a bit of skepticism around like developers just want to write code. Why would we give them something like a visual way to build out these workflows? And my response was, well, actually, like, you know what? I've received a ton of feedback from developers that do want to build visually. In fact, there's 2 things that are visual: architectures and workflows. And so why not give them the capability to build these out visually? And there's lots of code that still needs to be written within, say, all of the Lambda functions or other services that are being orchestrated here. But if we give people a way to build visually, it's going to like unblock them in adopting the service and help them get started really, really quickly. And so we basically came up with this concept we call Workflow Studio, our UX designer at the time, Gabe, was emphatic about the fact, like, we're not building a drag and drop interface, we're building a drag and snap interface. And what he meant by that, kind of nuanced, but what he meant by that was like, we're going to give developers a visual way to build that's sort of like correct by construction, right? Like you drag something onto the pane, you drop it, it ends up in a legal location. It generates the code for you in the background that represents like exactly what you've done. We update it in real time, and basically we only allow you to do like legal things in this like visual representation. And so we basically took this. We also had a UX researcher who took this in front of customers, and what we did was we iterated and iterated and iterated on an experience until the data showed, the user data showed that we had got it right, and then we went in and launched it. And within like a week, thousands of customers were successfully building workflows on top of it. And we had to overcome skepticism all the way up to the VP level, basically, to build it. But once we built it, it kind of started to change perceptions of like what's possible on the visual side of things, and it's been very successful in terms of like both data and like customer feedback. So that's how we ended up with it, to make kind of a long-winded answer to your question. But
cool. So I mean,
customer
literally
feedback.
people coming to reInvent, and you speak to one of the product people, show some of the things that are going on, and then the virtual cycle goes back. We build something and come and release it about a year later. So it's an awesome story. I love the feedback. We are about to jump into a demo from Pooya, but just before then, Peter, we were talking about the GenAI before. Is there an option to use GenAI from other providers instead of Bedrock, OpenRouter, I would say, top of my head, absolutely yes, because Step Functions can call any HTTP endpoint. So if there's anything on the internet that you want to call and get a response from, yes, seems as though that would be possible. Anything else to add, Dan or Pooya?
Yeah, one thing I want to add to that is a common pattern that we're seeing actually is so you can call directly from the workflow, or in some cases, like building these prompts and kind of handling the response can be quite complex. And so we see a lot of customers using Lambda for that directly. Yeah. And from Lambda, you can obviously call any endpoint. So yeah, you're not restricted to just using Bedrock, either from Step Functions or from Lambda when you're building.
Yeah, no, you do have the flexibility. Lots of people joining as well. Javad from Italy, thank you very much. Tertes from Nigeria, Bahrain, Divya from Bahrain. We've got Prince from India, and we have Veronica from New Zealand. Oh, New Zealand, that's the other side of the world, so that must be later at night, I think, for you as well. And also Cardo joining us from Brazil, so thank you very much. Daniel Labibe again said, our good old famous Eric Johnson stated that we should use step functions in any microservice implementation to allow for error handling, as well as the addition of new features, new microservices, orchestration. Agree. I'm speaking to two step functions people, so I suppose they would be inclined to say yes rather than no. But anything else to add?
I can add something to it. Before joining Amazon, I was a customer of a step function too. I actually was using many serverless services from AWS. And how I was looking at AWS step function was not as a workflow, but as a glue between different serverless services I am using, and making a bigger service or application by joining and gluing all these smaller services. So we have some customer like myself before that they don't think of workflow, but are still using a step function.
Yeah, so I suppose that becomes, because even the term workflow, some people aren't going to understand transactions, and then they go, oh, I don't really have a transaction in my in my application, when often you do, but you don't realize that the workflow term is also, quite generic as well. So yes, you just want to build an application that's going to integrate across AWS and connect to lots of different parts. So hence the workflow can be useful. And just one point I wanted to say, Eric does say that, which is valid, and you can start with step functions being really, really small. It doesn't have to be these big, complex, overarching workflows. You can have something really small that is going to, connect to something, retrieve something, connect to a Lambda function, do something, and finish. That could be it. It can be a really small step functions workflow. And a tip as well, Dan mentioned it earlier, standard and express workflows. Express workflows are fast and furious. If they run under 5 minutes, don't need to wait for a human in the loop, they can be significantly cheaper as well. So actually, as cost-saving tip as well, is even try with express workflows, see if that fits your use case, and then you can expand to standard workflows as well. If you need more functionality, maybe you can save some costs as well. And the cool thing is you can nest one in another. So you can also have a sort of maybe overarching standard workflow with some express workflows, which you could distribute out to thousands of things, or do distributed map or in that. So yeah, very flexible, worth looking at as well. Pooya, I think we should get to the demo. I know we have a technical audience who are sort of scrambling to see what this all looks like. So let me bring up your screen.
Yeah, okay. Can you see my screen now? We
can see your screen, yes. Okay. So we're in the Step Functions console, okay.
Yes, exactly. I want to start from the console, and then I will switch to Visual Studio Code and AWS Toolkit. So as Dan mentioned before, the Workflow Studio is a visual workflow service in AWS. And to show it, let me create new state machine. And when I am creating a new state machine, you will see our Workflow Studio. So this Workflow Studio is the visual tools to create a workflow by drag and snapping different steps. We have some steps, built-in steps, and also we have task state. And task state could be any service, any API in AWS. And as we mentioned before, it could also call external services with HTTP APIs that we have here. So all we need to do is to drag and drop it in our workflow to create our workflow. So here I drop a Lambda service. Then I want to, for example, simple put a wait and then call something else like another Lambda. That's all we need to do. So you need to drag, and as we said before, it's a drag and a snap. You can't decide about the position. It automatically put it in the correct position. And behind the scene, it will create ASL code for you. ASL is the language we are using for defining our workflows. So this Workflow Studio help our customer to visually create this workflow. But I can say with everything good, also comes something a little awkward. And for a step function, we make Workflow Studio and AWS Console, Step Function Console, so good that customers have a difficult time to have the same experience when they are working locally or outside our console. So to address this, we now have the same functionality, Workflow Studio, inside AWS Toolkit, and you can enjoy the same visual editor inside Visual Studio Code. Before I go and start showing the AWS Toolkit, let me also show the compute you see here. So as I said before, you can use almost any API available in AWS. For example, let me search for something like translate. Yeah, you can see there are a lot of APIs here you can use. For example, translate text from Amazon Translate. So if I want to translate something, all I need to do is to drop it here and put the language I want to translate from and target translation and my text. That's all I need to do to call this API. And as I think you can see my pop-up here. For every parameter that API, that method accept, we are showing you the help. So you don't need to remember them or go to the internet and search for them. You can easily see all the parameter you need here. By default, we are showing all the mandatory parameter here. And also there could be some optional parameter. So let me add another thing like copy object, open the argument, and try to add something new. As you see, we can see all the parameters you need for this call here with all the helps in line here. So it helps you to easily glue and integrate different services in your workflow and call them without writing a code. So it's a low code, and behind the scene, it will create the ASL for you. Okay, so now
I don't think I'd seen that well enough. Just the SDK integrations of having the sort of type ahead and just being able to code as you were in your IDE if you had a strongly typed thing. I think I have used that, but I hadn't seen it look so good. So yeah, that is super useful because I mean the SDKs are vast and they're huge and there are a lot of kind of things. And sure, you can jump to the docs and see what all the parameters are, but yeah, just to be able to browse it natively in here is awesome.
Actually, it's very funny because I had a customer reach out. They didn't use Workflow, but they used Workflow Studio as a document for all the APIs. When they wanted to work with the API, want to find all the parameters, they came to Workflow Studio to find the parameters. It was the easiest way for them to find them instead of going to AWS documents.
Awesome. I think it's also worth adding, like Pooya, a number of these improvements that you're showcasing are new too, right? Like if you've used Workflow Studio in the past, you're going to notice some changes versus like recent months with things like the type ahead and stuff like that.
Yeah, so we launched Workflow Studio 3 or 4 years ago, and we constantly improve this. So 4 years ago, it was not like this, much simpler, and we are adding new features by addressing the customer feedbacks and reach out. Okay, so now let me switch to my Visual Studio. So I have Visual Studio, and before I start going to code, I want to go to my plugins. So what you need here is AWS Toolkit. If you install AWS Toolkit, I believe the version you need is 3.49 to have Workflow Studio. So if you don't have it, you can install AWS Toolkit. And if you have a version that is older, please update it to the latest version. And after you do this, you can create a new file. Let me save this file as, let me call it my test1.asl.json. So we used asl.json and asl.yaml as a extension for the file. And if you create any file with this file extension, Visual Studio Code automatically start and show our plugin. So you will see Workflow Studio right away here to interact and create your file. You don't need to go through your ASL code. Let me add a very simple Lambda task again. And now let me also open the same file with a code editor. And let me show them side by side. Okay. So you can see the code we have in that file, and also you can see our Workflow Studio. And now let me add something new here, another Lambda. So right away, you see any interaction you do with this file, you get the update in the file. I can do the same thing in the other side. For example, I can come to the file, change the name of this to my Lambda invoke 3. And then you see the same update in the Workflow Studio. So here, our Workflow Studio works with your file locally, and you don't have any interaction with the cloud for authoring your workflow. One thing I need to mention here before going more deep in other features is, as I showed you before, you have searching over all the APIs available in AWS And also for each API, we are showing all the parameter and help for that. And it's not coming for free. It has a huge payload. It's a gigabyte of data. You need to have access to see all these APIs and documents for them. So this plugin is not completely offline. And if you are not connected to internet, you can't use the Workflow Studio. And our plugin detects this. So if you open your Visual Studio Code, but you don't have access to internet, it will automatically switch to the code view. So it will not block you from working, but you don't have all the feature when you are offline.
Okay. Is there some sort of cache? Is this all the time, or when you first open it up, it's going to cache some of those SDK things, and then if you disconnect it, it'll continue working, or you haven't got connectivity at all? You're only going to see the code.
Yeah, it will cache all this data. For example, let's say you worked with S3 APIs before. We are caching the data we fetch for the documents, APIs, and properties of that. So it's not like we are getting data from the internet all the times, but when you are opening the Workflow Studio, we will check if you are offline or not. And then we are deciding, should we show the code view or the Workflow Studio? But after that, anything that is cached and used before, we are not reaching to internet for that.
Okay, good to know.
Okay.
Can I mention one more thing? So Pooya, as you dragged the Lambda state in, if you look at the code there, you'll see there's more code than just the invocation of the Lambda, and that's because Workflow Studio is also we've built in a lot of logical defaults related to error handling into the experience, and so there's this kind of workflows are playing in this area called durable execution, and what it does is, it allows you to build applications that are sort of safe for the cloud, and so you look at that extra code that's been added in there. That's things like retries with a retry interval and attempts, etc. And basically this is what is kind of our recommended best practices for invoking a Lambda function. Well, they're built into the tool and automatically added into the code as part of the experience, and then it just makes makes everything sort of safer and safer as you run it and more durable.
Okay, so yeah, we talk often about step functions and a workflow being able to take, because often you build a lot of error handling into your code. If then statements, do this, do that, if this error is something, and you can actually take a lot of that out of step function, out of your Lambda function and run it in step functions to do that orchestration. But then, that's still code that you're taking out, but this is taking sane defaults. Even if people can't read the text over there, and it says interval seconds 1, max temps 3, back off rate 2, and then jitter strategy full. So that's pretty complex, distributed systems, back off a jitter and all those kind of things. And it's just there as the defaults. You don't have to think about it, but you can obviously tweak it if you want to. So yeah, that's super useful.
Yes. Okay, so let me show it. So for this Lambda function, when we are going to the error handling tab, you can see there is a retry, and also there is a timeout. There is a catcher. So with retry, you can say which error you want to retry and how many times you want to retry, what is the interval between the retries, maximum type of attempts, and also you can have different back-off rates, and also we have a jitter. So you can create a very complex retry strategy for your Lambda. And when you do all the retries and you exhaust it, you also can add a catcher. So you can say, okay, if for any error that you are deciding for this, for example, my go to state all, any errors, I want to fall back and go to a different state. So you have catcher, you have retry, and also you have timeout. You don't need to write any code in your Lambda, or you don't need to wrap your Lambda with anything else to have these features. And when you are creating this retry catcher, you will end up with this retry block and catch block in the ASL code.
Okay, and yeah, you can also think of that, if you're doing, as we were talking about the GenAI stuff earlier, if you've got the HTTP endpoints, obviously you want to have some retries or error logic or that kind of thing, and some back off and jitter if you don't want to overwhelm the system. And yeah, that's built into step functions. It's easy to see over here. You're not having to write a Lambda function to then call out to that API and handle that all within code.
Okay, so before I move further to the demo, there is a question about the map and choice. Let me address that. So
Peter, thanks.
Like any other workflow, you can have a choice. You can decide between multiple different branch by different rule, and based on those rules, you can move to a right, left, different branch. And when you have a choice, you can create your rules, and for rules, you can write your condition that decide between rules. Imagine it's a if condition or switch case in your language. So you can write your choice. And also, if you are not, you don't want to write this condition yourself, we also have a okay, let me add something here for you first. Okay, so we can create the rule here. And the other thing we have, the question was about the map. So with the map, we can create iterations. So let's say you have some steps that you want to repeat multiple times for your data. For example, let's say you have 10 S3 files, and for each S3 files, you want to do some operations. So you can repeat them inside this map. And also, the good thing about this map is we added a distributed map recently. Actually, not recently. I think it's at least 2 years. And with distributed map, you can iterate over a huge amount of data, up to 100 million records. You can go and process them. And
sorry, say that again, Pooya. How many millions?
Yeah, so distributed map, I believe it will, you can go up to 100 million iteration.
Cool. That should do my own CSV parsing little demo application quite well, I think.
Yeah, let's say you have a huge collection of S3 files and you want to do some processing over it. I believe this distributed map is the easiest way to do it in AWS services. Okay. Now let me continue the demo for the toolkit. So let me close this test ASL and go to something a little more bigger, complex. So as I mentioned, you can have your ASL definition as a JSON. Actually, let me use this button in the top, return to default editor. You can easily click this default editor to go to the code view if you want to switch between them. And also, when you're opening, if you look at the top of the file, there is a small font here, published to a step function. With this function, this button, you can create this resource in the cloud. And also, you can switch back to the Workflow Studio. The second option here is open with Workflow Studio. So you can switch between code and the text. So here I have a bigger workflow, and the code here is a JSON again, but I have the same one as YAML. Some of our customers prefer to work with the YAML file. So let me open the YAML file this time. Okay. And let me go to the code editor. So here you will see the same workflow definition, but this time defined as YAML. You can see that here is much easier to read. The indentation between lines is, I don't know, I think make it easier to read. And also the first line, if you look, you have a YAML comment. In JSON, you can't have a comment, but in YAML, you can put YAML comment in anywhere you want.
Oh.
But there is one restriction with the Workflow Studio. When you're opening the same file, you see a notification in the top that is warning you about the comment in the YAML file is not supported. You can still open the file with comments, but the consequence is if you do any change here and save it, you will lose that comment. So if I go here, I change, for example, this retry block and save it, and then go to the code. As you see, I am losing my YAML comment. But the good thing is we are not messing up with the undo redo. So even if you do a undo in this file, you will get back your change and you can see your comments here.
Cool. Yes, schizophrenic web developer says, yeah, we prefer YAML because we write less code. But it does say YAML is harder if you copy and paste from LLMs because of the indentation. I had the same thing. Well, not just LLMs, but also not just YAML, but also in Python, obviously, needs its indentation. But it was cool that an LLM agent was able to look over it and go, oh, yes, I'm sorry, I messed up. I didn't have my correct indentation and fix it as well. So good old YAML and JSON.
Yeah, so we have both options. The other thing that we have, that also you have it in our console, is when you are opening any workflow, you can export, import, and the export is giving you two options. So you can export to JSON or YAML. So if you have something in JSON, you can switch and change it to YAML easily. I can click this YAML definition. It will create a new file for me, and I can save it. And now I have a new file for the same JSON file, but now it's in YAML.
And also, I just see on one of your export options there where you had the SVG or PNG. And when Dan was talking earlier about working with your business designer, you can see how visual this is. If you went to a business designer and said, well, I've designed this workflow for you. Can you please run through it and check it's all okay? They're going to be like, maybe, but yeah, just looking at the actual visual representation in the diagram over there, that's much easier for a business person to look through. And I've even used it internally when we've been building some demos, to be able to look at that and go, oh, we're doing the right kind of thing. Yes, process one, claim process. If you look at it like that, a business person who doesn't understand any code or even workflow language is able to understand that and iterate over that.
Yes, so for export, we have two options. You can create PNG or SVG file. I created one here, so we have the SVG file now. Let me go back. Yes, so here in the top, there is an import export button. You can export the definition that is giving you a file, and also graph that is creating a picture for you.
Cool, excellent. Now, we were talking locally here, but then how does one convert or switch between the actual Workflow Studio in the cloud and the IDE one? Is that sort of an upload, load, download process, or what's that sort of integration between the two?
Okay, so if I understand correctly, you want to switch between what you have in the cloud and go locally, or the opposite?
Or either way, I'm now deploying something locally and I want to send it up into the cloud. What are my options?
Okay, so you have multiple options. I believe the biggest use case is customer are creating their resource as part of their infrastructure as code. So let's say, for example, you are using CDK or Terraform, and you're creating all your resources, like your Lambda, your step function, and then you want to deploy it. So that's one scenario. In this scenario, you don't want to deploy your Workflow Studio separately, and you're going through the deployment for the whole stack. So let's say I have a CDK. As part of the CDK, I have a workflow, and the workflow is in this file. And when I create this, I can run my CDK deploy, and it will be deployed to the cloud. You can also do it only a step function without deploying other resources. And as I showed this before, you can create publish to a step function. You can choose your region, and you can deploy and create your resource in the cloud.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. Now, I mean, one other thing I know, obviously, when you talked about infrastructure as code and whether using Terraform or SAM or CDK or that kind of thing. Definition substitutions are an important part of step functions because you need to have these step functions somewhat generic because maybe you're going to have test and dev stacks and all that kind of thing. So how does that work?
Okay, so let me go back to the console first. Let me remove this. And let's start with a simple workflow. Hey, delete. Okay, so let me add a Lambda function again. So I want to orchestrate a Lambda function. So as you mentioned, we need to use one of my Lambda function here. So in my form, I have some options. I can put my function name here, or I can select one of my function that exists in my account. So Workflow Studio automatically fetch and get the list of existing Lambdas, show all of them to you, so you can select them. You don't need to write it yourself or copy and paste the ARN yourself. If I go to the code, you will see the function name populated based on your Lambda ARN. But okay, now let me switch back to the Workflow Studio. Let me open my simple workflow again. Here I have a Lambda function, similar. But when I am coming to my form, now you see the difference. Here I can enter my function name, but the second option here is for your infrastructure as code. As you mentioned, usually when you have your CDK or your CloudFormation stack or Terraform, you are creating your Lambda here too. You don't have existing Lambda. So here in the CloudFormation substitution or definition substitution, I can use my definition substitution to point to any resource I have. For example, let's call it my process one Lambda function. And now I need to, I didn't. Okay, let me type it one more time. Process one.
So that's your logical name within your CloudFormation template.
Exactly. So I will define my resource, this Lambda, in my CloudFormation, and then I need to point to that Lambda here in my workflow. So when I want to run this, I really don't have it yet. I didn't create it before. So, and also when you look at my code, here, the function name is a definition substitution. It doesn't point to any execution, any Lambda ARN yet. So again, let me switch back to console. In console, I can click on the test state and test only this state, run this Lambda and see how this Lambda works. And here, if you look, the option I have is selecting one of my rules. I can pass or define my input. But if I go to VS Code again, and I click the same test state, now you have one additional section here for definition substitution. For any definition substitution you used in your steps, the test state is giving you an option to point to your Lambda function or the Lambda you want to use for your testing. Let me switch to this one. So here, if you look, I have a Lambda function here. Let me zoom a little more. That's a Lambda function. And here for the function name, I am using this process one function name. And I have the ARN. And when I want to run this, one thing if you are not familiar with the step function, when we are running the step function, we are executing this, you need to use a rule. We are using this rule to get all the permission you have to run different services you are using inside your step function. So legacy lambda call. Here, I put my function ARN for this definition substitution, and now I can start my test.
Fantastic. Yeah, and just for people who know, I mean, this test state is so super useful because obviously it's for Lambda functions, but an external API or calling anything, and you can just go in here in the console, do your state input, and also what is cool is you are specifying that execution rule, so you're also testing the permissions, and then yeah, this is super useful. I mean, this whole test state thing I think is so useful to be able to build. And then as I presume that you are in the local code. You see, weirdly, I wasn't even sure you were in the console or the local code. So obviously, you had the definition substitution, which tells you you're local.
Okay.
Cool. This is awesome. Quick question from Daniel. Can I use JSON answer and JSON path in the VS Code? I presume that is a yes.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Can I use JSON answer and JSON path in VS Code?
Yes.
So yeah. Okay.
So recently, when we launched the step function, we had JSON path, but last year we also add support for JSON data and variable. So you have two different way to define or process your input, output, and your data. The old way, classic way, was the JSON path, and now we have also JSON data. With JSON data, you have more flexibility. And when you are coming to Workflow Studio, either in the AWS Console or in the Workflow Studio, you have option to switch between these two. So to demonstrate this, let me start with a new file. test2.asl.json. Okay, so here is my empty file. When I start creating my workflow, I didn't add anything yet. In my form, I have two options. I can use JSON data that is recommended, and also we have the JSON path that we had for a long time. And so you can switch for your entire workflow, which one you want to use.
And actually, I just spotted Vlad actually answered the question. So I love it when people are watching and they answer our own questions. Thank you, Vlad, for saying, yes, you can do that as well. We are a quick short of time. I just want to say thank you to some people. We did have Nolan joining us from Los Angeles. Thank you very much. A couple of other people, not sure where, Mishan from wherever, from, I presume that's Illinois. Thank you, Zara. Naveed from Pakistan. Atlanta checking in via tree. Thank you very much. Babish from India. Marzina as well. Hello. So yeah. And Daryl finishes off the show saying it's super useful to edit step functions in VS Code. Thanks for the feature. I used to edit the JSON directly. Was making way too many mistakes. You sound like me. I'm starting UI in the console, but this is much better. So Daryl, thank you very much. Dan and Pooya, thanks so much for an awesome demo. Really appreciate you putting this all together. Step functions just gets better and better all the time. That's what building the service in the cloud really means. So yeah, thank you for your time today. Pooya and Dan, the details are in the show notes. So if you do need to get hold of them, that'll be super good. And for everybody else, thanks for joining us. We will be back actually with more stuff for step functions next week. And just because I'm South African, Lyndon, hello from South Africa. Yeah, we will be back with more step functions next week, where we actually are going to be talking about private integrations for step functions in the Event Bridge. So we're on a roll. So really appreciate all the good step function stuff. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dan and Pooya, most of all, and everybody else for watching. And we'll see you same time, same place. Remember, if you're not in America, it's probably an hour earlier because the time zone differences. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.